Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the regular Friday afternoon webinars hosted by the Center for Energy Studies, Baker Institute for Public Policy, Rice University. I'm very pleased this afternoon to be joined by three longtime pals. Bill Gilmer, who I've known ever since he came back to Houston and joined the Fed. Brett Perlman, who I've known since he was at the Public Utility Commission of Texas, and Steve Kleinberg, who may not remember this, but I've known since I was working on my PhD. So now that I've successfully done a very good job of revealing my age, what I will do is just quickly move into our discussion. We do have slides to share with people. This is going to be a robust and detailed discussion. It may seem a bit early to some of you to title this the way I chose to, that we're in a recovery room. That's actually an open question that the panel can weigh in on as we proceed. But I think it's not too early to start thinking about where we are. The genesis for the idea of having this session actually resulted when I was pulling together a very early piece for the Houston Chronicle at the very start of all of this stuff. Watching things on the oil market side and generally speaking in the energy space caused me to reflect on where we were in the 1980s for those of us who had the pleasure of experiencing those times. And I say pleasure because when I was putting that piece together for the Chronicle, a lot of amazing things happened in Houston during the mid-80s. And I think it's always worthwhile, even while we make sure that we're doing our due diligence, we're cognizant of the reality checks and everything else, that we're also very well aware of the positive things that come out of experiences like this. And so I think it's a good idea to think back to those times and what we did to rebuild the city and move forward after that experience. We've had many experiences since then. I was pointing out to the panel before we started this, none of us actually have anything in our slide decks or prepared content related to Harvey, but Harvey is still around. We're still recovering from it. It's still part of the picture for Houston. And so on top of that, we have these twin challenges of what's going on in the oil and gas industry in particular, and then what we're experiencing with the COVID virus. I'm a gardener. I'm always looking for green shoots. And so I did want to kind of start off by just pointing out some of the news bits that people should be aware of. We did have a very nice bump in retail sales in May. That will probably continue. We're making very slow progress in terms of returning to air travel. That's probably going to be one of the slower recovery things in this experience. Pardon me. And just to point out, on the fuel side, we have gasoline sales back in the picture. Distillates never really went away. The U.S. Energy Information Administration is expecting rebalancing of the energy markets in 2021. And we have another possibility of improved natural gas prices. This is a result of things we're watching at the center very closely. As we pull back on oil production, we're pulling back on associated gas production. We're likely to get some improvement in gas prices as a result. This will have mixed results, but it would be a good thing for producers to be able to get more revenue for that side of their production streams. It will challenge some of the views people have on exports, but we'll see how that goes. So with no further ado, I want to swing into the views on Houston's economy by Bill Gilmer. So Bill, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Michelle. Let's see, I'm mostly going to be talking about Houston today. I've got 9 slides in 10 minutes. So in terms of slides, this is a drive-by effort at best. And But I think Michelle's going to set these up so you'll be able to see them later and study them at length if you want. I have to start by saying I would be pretty foolish to even pretend that any of us can see much of the future right now. You can start with the virus. We don't know the case infection rate, the case fatality rate, if reinfection is possible, herd immunity is possible, when there might be effective treatment or vaccine. Then we would have to know, if we were going to predict the future, what the public health officials, how they would react, even if they knew how the virus was going, especially to some of these sweeping mandates we have seen. So, and then even if we understood exactly what the public health officials were up to, how do we, at this point in time, we don't even know how to separate that mandatory social distancing from the reactive social distancing that would go on anyway. So there's plenty of uncertainty out there, including the fact that this shock means that none of the economic models work right now. It's about as simple as that. It's a structural break. The next slide, Michelle. Let me say a word about what we have done. We have with the stay-home orders. Not to say they're good or bad, either one. I'm not going to go there for sure. But let's talk about, there was a 2006 study done by the Congressional Budget Office, and they laid out the way they thought that a pandemic should run in terms of events. You'd start with the reactive social distancing. You'd have fewer customers in your bars and restaurants. And then over a 6 or 8 month period, your disease is going to basically spread through the workplace. And that's what causes the economic issues. Millions lose jobs, worker shortages are acute, plants close, business and consumer uncertainty, slow spending, and then eventually herd immunity or a vaccine would finally slow the virus. And at different points in time, there was this picture of the local ordinances being used across the country, much of the same way they were in 1918, 1919, for example. With this epidemic, we have basically pulled everything forward. We have made everything happen at once. And we have created a huge economic shock, widespread business shut down immediately, a huge shock and uncertainty immediately. Millions losing their jobs, not over 6 or 8 months, but now. And it's not about millions, of course. This is the good news with the stay-home orders. Millions don't fall ill, and the fatality rate is much lower. And a lot of those job losses that are happening now would have happened anyway as everyone got ill and was pulled out of the workforce. But in a lot of ways, these stay-home orders are a play for time. The epidemiological studies tells us you can lower that peak mortality, you can flatten the curve, but the cumulative mortality doesn't fall nearly as much. Next slide, Michelle. And this is the kind of shock that it can generate. This just shows you Texas and Houston, the new initial unemployment claims rising week by week up to a quarter of a million, well over a quarter of a million in 1 week in the middle of April. And yeah, I can put the United States right on top of this, other than the fact that Houston and Texas peaked a week or so later. There's not any difference as you move across the country. And most of these job losses, a combination of mandatory and reactive social distancing, plus that economic shock that I talked about. Next slide. And here's where your job losses come from. I don't think there's any surprise. These are made March and April. Job losses in Houston, we lost a total of 325,000 jobs. And for that 2 month period, 225,000 of those jobs are in accommodation, air transportation, entertainment, food and drink, healthcare, private education, things like nurseries, for example, retail sales. And these are the ones sensitive to this combination of enforced and reactive social distancing that I talked about. 70% of the losses occur there. If you look at the little green box at the bottom, the economic base jobs are supposed to be the jobs that guide the economy. These are the ones that determine growth and expansion and contraction. and they're relatively small. They're pointing to what is essentially a typical to maybe a little worse than typical recession in Houston right now. So you have to believe that these reactive and mandatory orders, reactive social distancing, they're playing a really big role right now. And in fact, in May, we just got the numbers for this morning for May, and Houston has turned the corner and added back about 62,000 of those jobs, and about 290,000 across the state of Texas came back in May. So perhaps we're on our way. Next. And for every job that's lost, it's sometimes hard to remember that for every job that's taken away, the Treasury has passed out a ton of money in income payments. Stimulus from the Treasury is $2.9 trillion right now. 1.3 trillion for protecting jobs, direct payments to individuals, supplementing unemployment insurance. If we took that 1.3 billion and divided it by $33,900, then 33 million Americans would be capable of drawing their average 80% of their average annual wages and salaries. Unfortunately, we're not passing it out that way, but it's a lot of money that has been put back on the other side of the equation. And then, of course, all the programs from the Federal Reserve. Michelle, next one. For Houston, this looked like it was going to be a typical downturn until oil and gas made its recent dive into the depths. Oil and gas in Houston's been kind of an ongoing soap opera. We had the credit crunch last summer, the oil war between Russia and the Saudis, kind of this bizarre contest to see who could sell oil at the cheapest price. And that, of course, has now turned into a virus-driven collapse. Basically, with the stay-home orders across the world, the demand for oil falls from 85 million barrels per day, from 100 million barrels per day down to 85. And now all parties are on board to try to clean this mess up. And we're looking at first trying to get supply and demand back into balance to find some sort of market clearing price. Then once we can find the fundamentals, we're pretty sure they're going to be ugly at best through 2021, probably $45 per barrel. And then 2022, probably before we see a $60 or better price. So difficult times for oil as we try to get the world economy back into balance. Next slide. Oil in Houston. For oil, I'm going to be talking about, when I say oil-related jobs, I'll simplify it and say producers and services and machineries and fabricated metals. And right now, my guess is around 31,000 oil-related jobs lost to the downturn. And by the time we get to early 2021, and what happens between now and early 2021 with supply and demand out of whack is anyone's guess. The rig count is in free fall. Oil services are clearly in retreat. So briefly, I'll say 31,000 losses, but much bigger in between, and hard to define how big that might be. Why not more oil jobs lost? We've already cleaned up a lot of that a lot of the problem in 2015 and 16. We lost 72,000 jobs in 2015-16, and we only restored 21,000 of them that came back. And we have already seen, even before the COVID outbreak, the rig count was already down 25%. So just to put raw meat out there for Brett, is there a place for fracking post-COVID? Yes, there is. If there's a place for $60 oil and a return to 100 million barrels per day, there has to be a place for fracking out there. The next slide. And let me just close by let's just assume, and it is an assumption, that this virus is largely come under control by the time we get to early next year, the middle of next year, herd immunity, treatment, vaccine, whatever. that puts aside all of those crazy numbers swinging back and forth in response to these enforced public orders and social distancing and what happens across the year. But if we can talk about fundamentals by that time, we're probably going to come out of this finding we have lost maybe 100,000 jobs below the prior peak and back in early in the first quarter of this year. So we're talking about a long, slow haul out of this as well. And ultimately, by the time we get to the middle of 2021, job growth is going to be back growing well above trend again. We'll be adding 80 to 90,000 jobs in 2021, and again in 2022, first as the US economy comes back, then as oil prices come back. And then we'll see after 2022 back to trend growth in Houston, which is around 65,000 jobs in the long run. So it's going to be a tough pull in front of us. There's no question about that. I don't think it's the end of the world yet, or necessarily the end of the energy industry here in Houston. But we'll see how it works out. We can talk about it later. So thank you, Michelle.
Okay.
Okay. I'm next, I guess. I could just say ditto and we can go to Steve. So Bill did a great job of really teeing this up. I'm basically going to just emphasize most of the points that he made, maybe with a few small changes, and really focus maybe a little bit more of my comments, perhaps on the long-term impacts, and talk a little bit more about the energy transition. But I think he really made all the salient points. I'll start really by talking about maybe a little more about the changing role of the energy industry in Houston's economy. So if you go to the next slide. Next slide, Michelle. Michelle, can you flip over to the next slide? Are you frozen?
Ooh.
Hey, Michelle.
Hello?
I think is she frozen there?
She's not moving. The picture's not moving.
I know. Oops. What happened there?
Whoa.
Disappeared. Oh no. Michelle is gone. Okay, let's see if she comes back.
Damn.
Let's see what happens. I could do my own presentation. I wonder if I can do that.
I don't think so. Can you control it?
I don't know. Cecilia, help me out here.
Yes, you can pull up the presentation and then just screen share.
Okay. Do you want me to do that or should I wait for Michelle to come back?
Yep, you can go ahead and do that.
Okay. Let me find my presentation then. Okay, so I'm just going to do that and hopefully she'll be back in a second. Let's see. What happened here? I don't see it though. Let's try it one more time. Huh. You guys, now I can't get screen share to work at all.
Oh, what can I say? Let's see if I can get mine up.
Oh, here, Michelle's back. Okay. Okay, I see something happened. Is that you? Are you back, Michelle?
Yes, which slide would you like me to be on?
Ah, what happened?
Okay.
Good question.
Okay, so go back to I'm back to the keep going up to the second, third. I think it's slide 3. One more up.
I
Okay.
apologize, everyone.
Okay, wonders of technology. Okay,
Yeah.
here we go. Okay, so the point I was going to make is Houston has outperformed the U.S. economy for many years, and this is a chart that shows per capita net income. So it's looking at sort of take-home pay. It's per capita net earnings less housing and taxes. So it's sort of what you might make in Houston or anywhere else versus other places in the country. And as you can see, we were doing better in Houston than anywhere else in the country. On the next slide, can you advance it now? Nope, other way. There we go. This is actually something Bill helped us with. It talks about the growth engines of Houston's economy, and it's really, it's kind of interesting. The 3 growth engines of Houston's economy are, we grow about a third of our economy grows at the rate of the U.S. economy. A third of it approximately grows because we have what we call pro-growth enablers, some of the low cost of housing, relatively affordable housing, low taxes, immigration. Steve will talk a little bit about that. And then the other third is because of the energy industry, the upstream part of the energy industry, which has been primarily a generator of high multiplier jobs. These jobs which generate other jobs, which create wealth. And we'll come back and talk about that in a few minutes. But this idea that the energy industry has been one of the drivers of growth, and I think Bill mentioned this in his presentation a second ago. We'll come back and talk about whether that will be true going forward. So that's sort of what is kind of the if you decompose the Houston into its components, that's what has driven our economy up to now. Next slide. So what's been happening over the the last couple of months, and what's going to happen in terms of the economic recovery? Next slide. So the answer is we don't know. What shape is this going to have? Is it going to be a V, a W, a hockey stick, a bathtub, a U? How long is it going to take? Is it going to be fast, long? Is it going to take days, weeks, months, years? Who knows? I think this is the point that Bill made. But what we can do is we can sort of look over the past history of other recessions. And if you look on the next slide, Michelle, here is just sort of the history of Houston recessions going back to the 80s, and including the current one. And just a few data points. As Bill mentioned, we've lost 330,000 jobs in total on the bottom there, the bottom line there. And my data is somewhere a little bit different from Bill's. About 20,000 of those jobs were in the energy sector. As he points out, a lot of those energy jobs had already been lost in the 15 to 16 era, the fracking bust, sort of the last sort of a downturn, and didn't come back. And I think we have hit the bottom, assuming we don't have a recurrence, and we don't really know what's going to happen, because as Bill mentioned, in the May data from the TWC report that just came out, Texas Workforce Commission report that just came out, showed that we added 73,000 jobs back. We still remain about 276,000 jobs below our February peak of 3.2 million jobs. So, I think you could say that hopefully we've we started coming back. So maybe this recession isn't quite as bad as the Great Recession if things start to get better, but we certainly don't know where this is going. In terms of the energy industry, I think that impact remains to be seen, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the next couple slides. So the next slide. How long would it take to recover those 276,000 jobs? Well, depending on what you believe, it could take a while. So I think this is going to be the question we're going to have to sort of watch. If we recover them on, as we have grown jobs on a long-term annual average, it could take up to 40 years. If we grow jobs, if these come back faster, perhaps it could be as quick as 2 years. So I think this is kind of what we're going to have to watch. We really don't know how fast this is going to go yet, and I think that's the point that Bill made. On the next slide. So let's just talk about where the energy industry for a second, where this is all headed for the energy industry. I think this is a little bit more of an open question. So if you look at the energy industry in Houston has been quite cyclical, and as I mentioned, we were already in this decline in employment before we entered the pandemic. As Bill mentioned, we were already in this the credit crunch, and we never really recovered very much from the fracking bust of 14 and 15. And so we're really now back to where we were in terms of job growth, almost back to 2007 in terms of where we are in terms of energy employment, about 220,000 jobs in the Houston region. On the next slide. And this has been, and then COVID hit, and what we saw is that really the oil and gas production in the U.S. Really started to fall out of bed, and this is a U.S. oil production dropped by 2.5 million barrels. A big part of that, perhaps a large chunk of that, perhaps 60% maybe was Texas. So a big part of the decline was in the Permian. On the next slide. And as Bill mentioned, this is going to be a long road to recovery. This is some IEA data, which is a forecast of how long it's going to take for some of that demand to start to come back. And while it is starting to come back, as Michelle said, that we're starting to see these green shoots, the expectation is that we have such significant inventories now that the combination of what we have in terms of oversupply and the fact that we have demand, which is going to be below what we had at the first of the years, means that it's going to take some time for us to work off and to get back to where we were. On the next slide. So this is a projection of how the market has sort of reset in terms of oil prices, and you can see this is just a survey of some investment banks post and pre-crash prices, and you can see that prices, at least in the survey data, have readjusted pretty significantly. Perhaps even in the long term, going out 4 to 5 years, between $5 and maybe up to $5 to $7, over the sort of the next really through 2030. So some significant expectations of declines in prices. So it could be, depending on what you believe, a long road back. And then the question becomes, what happens over the long term? In the next slide. And what are the long-term impacts of this on oil demand, and more importantly on the Houston economy? And it starts to get even a little bit more uncertain, because there are so many factors that affect long-term oil demand, and these range from are we going to start flying again, to how fast is decarbonization going to impact oil demand, to what is the impact on mass transit? Are we going to move back towards a trend towards less mass transit? Where is electric vehicle penetration going? Are we going to do more of this kind of stuff, telecommute more? Where will economic growth go? So there are scenarios that range anywhere from 80 to 120 million barrels per day. It's a very difficult set of factors to sort through. So we started to look at this on the next slide in terms of some scenarios-based work. And KPMG helped us with some modeling a couple years ago, and we're continuing to do this work on looking at sort of two axes, both a price axes on what would be some different scenarios, perhaps a scenario that said, you know, oil prices never recover on one end of the spectrum, to, you know, that we, as Bill was suggesting, maybe that we do rebound. And on the other axis, you know, how important is that upstream sector that I mentioned before to our economy? Does it continue to be the driver of our economy, or do we continue to diversify into other sectors? And as you know, in Houston, we started to do some work in looking at economic diversification. And so if you look at this on a 2x2 matrix, you can start to think about those two axes as having, you know, and do start to play some games with some numbers. And if you look on the next slide, we've started to look at these different scenarios. And here you have some of the results that sort of look at what would our growth be under various of these scenarios. So one suggests in the upper left-hand corner, sort of a back to the future, that we just go back to where we were. You know, everything's great. We don't diversify. We have historical growth rates, $60, and everything's fine, to a scenario where, you know, oil prices never recover. We're in the $30 to $40 range. If we don't diversify, then, you know, things may not look so rosy, to maybe some other scenarios where perhaps oil prices recover modestly, and then there is some selective diversification, which gives us a path to perhaps some a different future than we might have today. So this is kind of what we're doing at the center. We're looking at all these different scenarios to try to figure out, where do we want to go? How do we take that path that we have for Houston, those three drivers of our economy, and perhaps put a fourth engine in there, so that we have a more diversified path to an economic future. And anyway, I'll turn it back over to Steve. I know he'll have some thoughts on some of this stuff as well.
Okay, great. Well, delighted to be here. And I was asked to talk about the demographic shift. And of course, it all ties in together. We did our first survey back in 1982. 2 months after that survey, the oil boom collapsed. Houston went into major recession and then recovered into a very different world. And some of the sort of discontinuities are evident again. But the big one in terms of demographics was, of course, it was Anglos pouring into Houston during the 1960s and 70s. And after the oil bust in 1982, the Anglo population of Harris County stopped growing. Next, let's show the next slide. Michelle, you there? Slides? Yeah, okay. So one after this. Next slide. Okay, this is the, well, okay. Doesn't matter. Go back a second. Can you go back, Michelle? Okay, stop there. Wait, no. Forward, one. Oh, see, that's what I was, okay, stop. The big story of America is, of course, that between 1492 and 1965, 82% of all the human beings on this planet who came to America, 82% came from Europe. The big story today is that after the racist laws were rescinded in 1965, and for the first time, opportunities were open to non-Europeans basically to come to America, 88% of all the new immigration in the last 35 years has come from Asia, Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean. And the United States, that had been an amalgam of European nationalities, is becoming a microcosm of the world. Next slide. Nowhere is this clearer than in Houston. You have New York, Los Angeles, Miami, Chicago, the big ones, and then right after Chicago, Houston, San Francisco, and now Atlanta, Boston, heading, transformations happening across all of America. No city has been changed as rapidly, as fully, as completely as Houston, Texas. Here's the next slide. This is the percentage of, this is the story of Houston, right? In 1960, there were 1.243 million people living in Harris County, Texas. This was our biracial world. 74% of us were Anglos, 20% African Americans, just 6% Hispanics, less than 0.5% were Asians. During the oil boom years of the 60s and 70s, Anglos were pouring into the city. By 1982, we'd become the 4th largest city in America, still an overwhelmingly Anglo city. After that oil bust of 1982, the Anglo population of Harris County stopped growing. And all the growth of this, the most rapidly growing city in America, has been the influx of African Americans, Latinos, and Asians. And by 2016, Harris County is now 42% Hispanic, 31% Anglo, 19% African American, 8% Asian. Here's another quick way to envision this. Next 4 slides, Michelle, very quickly show this. Okay, hold on one second. There are 1,320 census tracts in Harris County. In blue, in 1980, were all the census tracts of majority Anglo. In red was an African-American corridor, 3rd Ward and 5th Ward. Along the ship channel was a segundo barrio where the Latinos were, and a few places around the Beltway with no majority. Then here's 1990. Here's 2000. And here's 2020. 2010, a truly remarkable transformation. And Houston's destiny is to be where all of America is going to be as the 21st century unfolds. You can see the energy corridor, by the way, heading out to Katy as a sort of redoubt of Anglos in the inner city. We are a microcosm of all the world. And here's another critical piece that shows this. Next slide. This is why we claim that Houston is the most ethnically diverse major metropolitan area in the country. Houston and New York come closest of any of the major diverse, large metropolitan areas that have equal percentages of African Americans, Latinos, Asians, and Anglos. You can see Los Angeles has too few African Americans. Chicago has too many Anglos. Miami has way too few Asians. Houston is where the 4 communities meet. Greater balance, greater equality. All of us minorities, all of us called on to build something that has never existed before in human history, a truly successful, inclusive, equitable, united, multi-ethnic society made up of all the peoples, all the religions, all the ethnicities of the world. Tremendous asset and source of strength for the city, or it could end up tearing us apart. One other quick thing to point to is in the demographics is it's not just numbers, it's also ages. So show us the next slide. All right, so I've got babies on the left and old people on the right. I've got 12 different age categories from under the age of 5 to 75 years or older. It's not until you reach people in Harris County, Texas, who are 63 and older, that the majority of folks are still Anglos. And at each younger age group, the percentage of Anglos plummets, percentage of African Americans, Latinos, and Asians surges. Of everybody in Harris County, Texas today, who is under the age of 20, Harris County, not HISD, not inner city Houston, of everybody in Harris County under the age of 20, 52% are Latinos, 19% are African Americans, 9% are Asians, 21% of everybody under 20 is Anglo. So 2 big things to point to here, right? Over 70% of everybody under the age of 20 is African American and Latino, the 2 groups overwhelmingly most likely to be living in poverty. We know what poverty does to your ability to succeed in the public school systems. It is a safe statement to make that if Houston's African American and Latino young people are unprepared to succeed in the global knowledge economy of the 21st century, it is difficult, if not impossible, to envision a prosperous future for Houston. That is who we are and will be as the 21st century unfolds. The other point to make is that this is a done deal. Close the borders, build your fence, close off America, round up those 10 million people who are here illegally and send them wherever you think they're supposed to go. I tell people, 63-year-old Anglos are not going to be making a whole lot more babies. We'll do the best we can. We'll work on it every chance we get. you can go to the bank on this. No conceivable force in the world is going to stop Houston or eventually Texas and America from becoming more African-American, more Asian, more Latino, and less Anglo as the 21st century unfolds. We all know something about this, but it's just so powerful to see the data and to recognize the absolute clarity and inevitability of this process. Nothing in the world can stop this process of change. The only question our generation has been given is, how do we make this work? How do we ensure that this diversity becomes a tremendous asset that can be, as we position ourselves in the global economy, the gateway to the global marketplace, and make sure it doesn't end up tearing us apart and becoming a major liability, reducing rather than enhancing our competitiveness in the global economy. So as we think about the future in Houston and Harris County, it's important, I think, to incorporate into that thinking not only the sources of energy and the development of Houston as a third coast for the life sciences, but also to recognize how critical it is to make the investments in education that will prepare the folks who will be the workers and citizens and voters and taxpayers of Houston in the 21st century. Let me just go quickly over the last two slides. This is the United States today. You can see that same pattern. We're still an overwhelmingly Anglo country, but the pattern of aging of Anglos and the young people disproportionately non-Anglo is still evident. Next slide shows the projections for 2050, and that's very close to Houston and Texas today. So one of the claims I make in this book, of course, called Prophetic City, is that Houston is where the American future is going to be worked out. All of America will look like Houston looks today in about 25 years. We're there first. How we navigate this transition will have enormous significance, not just for the Houston future, but for the American future. And then I just want to show, I think the last slides are just sources of, these are two things we just published. One is the report on the 2020 survey, and the other is a book that just came out 2 weeks ago. And more information there. And of course, a much broader picture of Houston's as prophetic, not just demographically, but also in terms of its navigating of this energy transition. I thought one of the most powerful speeches given to the Greater Houston Partnership was Bobby Tudor reminding us that we are in an energy transition, and Houston is either going to lead that transition or it's going to become irrelevant to the energy systems of the 21st century. And how we manage that and at the same time invest in the education that's going to be so critical for the future is a big question for how we go forward effectively in the 21st century. Okay, enough from me. Michelle, great. Okay, I'll do about 10 minutes.
Right. Well, I offered you a chance to take over the screen, but you did okay, as it turned out.
Okay. Well,
We had an early question. While I think about the implication of Steve's last comments, because I think the challenge for us before we close today is to go exactly to this point about how are we going to do this? How do we make this work in a way that's part of the recovery and part of the advancement of the region? Before we get to that really hard question, though, a couple of simple ones. There was an early question on how all of our experience right now is likely to affect nonprofits. Of course, this was the thing that inspired my Houston Chronicle piece in the first place, was that somehow in the 80s, we managed to do that. We managed to build the Wortham Center. We managed to begin expanding our museums, our arts communities, and a lot of other things, and experiment with redesigning the city in some very interesting ways. And the question is, can we do that again? So Brett, I think that probably gets over to you in terms of, what the center is looking at and how to think about.
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think, it was really some visionary people who stepped up to the plate to make that happen at a time when Houston, the economy wasn't looking so good. And I think, we do a lot of work on training the next generation of leaders. And that was really why the center was founded. So I really do think that's going to be incumbent on this transition, is to look for that next generation of leaders that are going to start to address these problems, whether it's racial injustice, whether it's thinking about resilience. So we are at that, that pivot point, whether it's thinking about the energy transition, or how we get through this recession. What do we do about the next year in terms of making sure our the nonprofits that are basically the foundation of our, social system, of our social safety net, are there. I mean, it's a big unanswered question, and I think it's a question that needs to be a lot of people need to come together to start addressing.
Mhm.
One point.
Yes, Steve?
Quick adding to that is that how much our philanthropy, this tremendous generosity in the city, has depended on the success of the oil and gas companies. How much they, Exxon and Chevron and so on, have contributed. Will they still be able to make those kinds of contributions? And if not, how do we make up for that loss as we go forward and understand the need to make the investments that we need to make?
Well, that raises a challenge that I wanted to put on the table a bit. That's the implications of all of this for finances, fiscal balances, things like that. That's a difficult topic at this time because, again, we don't know what things are. We know that sales tax revenues are down. We know, like I said before, we've got the drag on our property tax collections at the county level from Harvey and related things. But you need a vibrant business sector, as Steve points out, to accomplish that. So, Bill, I think if you could take what you were thinking in terms of the outlook and flesh that out just a little bit in light of what Brett said, what do you think the prospects are for the Houston energy economy, the Houston energy sector continuing to be the stalwart? I mean, can we count on that, or do we need to do serious thinking about how we reshape the regional economy in order to sustain all of the other things that people like about our city and
Well, first of all, let me say I'm a little skeptical about diversification as a big net plus in some sense. Perfect diversification is the United States economy. And Brett showed you the screen that had basically our growth. About a third of our growth comes from the US, about a third comes from oil, and about a third comes from this collection of other factors. But basically, if you take oil out of the equation, somehow in 1990, we just made the world perfectly diverse for Houston in terms of its industry structure. It basically means that you take that third out and we would be growing about a third slower, right? Because we become like the US economy. We become perfectly diverse and we have given away that third. Or we can talk about, well, we're going to add tech, right? That's the solution, most common solution that you'll hear. But we want to do this. You want to do this because you're tired of the cyclicality. Houston gives you the growth, has given us the oil gives Houston growth and has for decades, keeps us at a 2.1% employment growth rate instead of a 1.4% growth rate. We're going to take that away and replace it with, and it's a decision to go for slower growth. So question one is, okay, how about if we just learn to fasten our seatbelt? How about if we just say, okay, look, we need to quit building 20 million square feet of office space we don't need right in the middle of the next bus? How about if we just made some careful decisions to think about what we're doing and realize that oil's not going to stay at $100 a barrel for more than a few months, not for the 20 years to put up an office building, for example. And the other question is tech. We're going to replace it with tech. The other metro area that has contributed, the only other metro area, certainly that I know of, that is a significant metro area that has had an oil bust on the scale of what happened in Houston in terms of the percentage decline is San Jose. And that was in 2000, 2001. And those jobs managed to come back a couple of years ago. We restored the jobs in San Jose that were lost from 2000. It took nearly 20 years to restore those jobs, partly because it's too expensive to live in California, and that's not so much the case here in Houston. But I'm very, very the idea of diversification giving us more growth, I think, is the wrong answer. Was there something else I needed to add to that, Michelle?
No, but I bet Brett has a rejoinder.
Well, I'm not sure that it's diversification away from oil. I think, one of the things that we've been looking at can we continue to excel in the energy industry in different ways? So as the energy industry evolves, can we continue to evolve with it? So, can we be the leader? We're looking at hydrogen, for example, as that evolves, as we move towards lower and cleaner and decarbonized forms of fossil fuels. Can we lead in those? Can we lead in electrification? When I was on the commission, Public Utility Commission, we moved from an electric sector that was primarily coal-based to one that was natural gas-based, and we built an incredible industry around natural gas, which is now becoming an export industry. So that's an example. We built a wind industry. These are things within our core competencies that we do well in Texas. That's I think where there might be opportunities for us that are similar to ways to growth opportunities that we might have that don't require a diversification that still allow us to grow within the skills and competencies that we have here as the energy capital of the world. So those are the things some of the things that we're working on, making Houston the low carbon energy capital of the world, for example.
I just want to throw this out there just for fun, because there are several questions about our link to offshore industries and the overlap between that and renewable industries. And one of the things I've been thinking about hugely is marine minerals extraction. We have groups in Houston that are looking into that. It's already part of our offshore technology conference mix. We can't do any of the energy transition that we are talking about doing without that. So I just want to throw that out there. People can be thinking about whether Houston might be able to make a contribution in terms of leading thinking about a minerals frontier that we may need at some point down the road. I also wanted to just add to the tech side. Of course, we've got a lot of development in our traditional energy space with regard to tech. In fact, it's extraordinary, really. And we look at it every once in a while. We talk about it. That's something that I think also people need to understand more about. Surveying the oilfield service space over the past few weeks, already before all of the health concerns, we were looking at ways of reducing costs and improving safety by pushing more of our oil and gas asset management into remote systems. And that is an enormous arena encompassing everything from data sciences to visualization to an amazing array of electronic sensing and data collection, technology development to support all of that. Which makes me now think it's time to go back to the really tough question, Steve. So how do we link our asset in demographics with our energy sector in a more explicit way? Because it's a knowledge industry. It's a basic industry. We produce real stuff, right? It could be called a brown industry. We need brown. That's the reality of life. But there is an enormous knowledge component in our energy sector. How do we break that glass ceiling to improve the interactions between that part of our energy industry complex and all of the groups that choose to live here, all of the people and communities and everything else?
Well, and the oil companies.
Answer.
Okay, let me get into this. The the oil business is a beautiful example of the shift that has occurred across all of reality, basically, from the blue collar world of unskilled and semi-skilled jobs that paid a living wage to a world of seismologists and geologists and high tech, a world where the source of wealth has less to do with natural resources and more to do with human resources, with knowledge and skills. That's where the whole story and the great challenge for Houston and for Texas, because in Texas, you didn't need education to make money. You made money by land, cotton, timber, cattle, oil. Source of wealth today is knowledge. And so how do we ensure that we make the investments in knowledge that will pay off 10 and 15 years in the future? How do we take the oil companies that are operating now and help them become energy companies for the 21st century? As Brett was saying, it's not a question of wanting diversification, it's a question of survival, of how do we're going to produce energy differently with different sources of different mixes as we go forward in the 21st century. Can Houston remain a center, remain in the lead, retain its leadership positions in carbon sequestration and the whole range of, we have Saudi Arabia of wind energy is Texas and tremendous amount of solar energy. Can we move forward effectively into becoming energy companies rather than oil and gas companies is a question of what will happen to that critical sector of Houston's economy in the 21st century. But education and knowledge and who will be the people working in these. The great advantage of the diversity is that Houston is at the center of the global economy. Every national economy on the planet has native speakers in Houston who have connections to their home companies and so as Houston is positioning itself as one of the nodes for the global economy. And that's a beautiful example of where this diversity can be the tremendous asset that it's intended to be, rather than, as we said, just tearing us apart, becoming a major liability. It only works if we make those investments from birth to college, from cradle to career. That is critical, and we tend not to think enough about the importance of investing in education. We're talking about positioning Houston for success in the long run, 20 years from now. What we spend on education today is going to be fundamental to the kind of city that we have at that time.
Yes, I agree with that. And that I think should be a future program, in fact, at education for our energy future. Brett and you and I and Bill, we can all think about that. There's one last question that I want to get to that's sort of related to all of this and related to some trends that are very interesting there. Even before all of this stuff was happening, we were seeing out migrations from other metropolitan areas and other states because of taxes, cost of living, as Bill pointed out, in places like California and other things. And Texas has been on the winning side of that. And I was looking at data the other day. Houston has been on the winning side of all of that, not just other cities in our state, but also Houston. So to a question here about people being interested to relocate to Texas, it's already kind of happening. How do you all see that continuing? What do we have to do to keep that vibrant stream of people continuing to want to come here and stay?
One of the themes of our research is the tremendously important role of quality of life issues in determining the fates of cities. People, if Houston's going to make it, it has to become a destination of choice, a place where the best and the brightest people in America who can live anywhere will say, I want to live in Houston, Texas. And that's a stretch for us, but we've been doing a whole bunch of things that are making this a more attractive city. But it's going to be, it's a pro-growth agenda for this city, is to turn Houston into one of the places where you want to be. And Houston never had to worry about that. During the oil boom years, come on down, who cares if it's ugly? So what if it smells? It's a smell of money. Right? This is a new world here too. And so the attention to quality of life, attention to walkability, to green spaces, to the Bayou Greenways Initiative, all of those are central infrastructure investments in making Houston, positioning Houston for prosperity, it seems to me, in the 21st century. And again, something we don't think enough about, but is really critical for this city. And it's a it's a reach for Houston because we don't have beautiful mountains and lovely beaches and scenery. And much of it is the beauty of Houston comes from the deliberate efforts on the part of the people who live here. We need to continue that process and improve it.
Bill, Brett, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think we need to be careful with the numbers here because as you look at it, we do continue to see high levels of migration into Houston from foreign, from outside the country into Houston. And a lot of that's tied to things like family reunification, for example, more than demographics. But for the last couple of years, if you look at migration into Houston from the rest of the country, it's been negative. People are leaving Houston for other parts of the country on net. I think part of that is a hangover from that 2015, 2016 bust and losing 70,000 oil-related jobs in that bust, for example. But at the same time, I think we're pretty close to having to ask ourselves some hard questions if that doesn't turn around about, once an accident, twice a coincidence, 3 times in a row. I think we're going to be asking some hard questions about exactly why we're not seeing in-migration from the rest of the country at this point in time.
Brett?
I was going to make that same point. Is the migration is all international migration, not domestic migration, and so we need to be attractive to the migrants from around the world to come here. And if you look at where those migrants are coming from, they're really coming from all over the world. They're not just coming from Latin America anymore. And so we are that melting pot, and that is really what makes Houston can make Houston an attractive place and can be a source of competitive advantage. And so being that place where people want to come and where it's an attractive place for people to come and build careers, and it will be a source of competitive advantage for us.
Well, I think what we need to think about here, and I'm going to give Steve the last word on this question, is the bigger picture for urban areas overall. Urban areas are being uniquely challenged right now all over the place. And a lot of what is starting to crop up in data as people track movements and look at behaviors and other things are some pretty interesting things about where people want to live, where they would choose to live. Do they want to stay in large metro areas at all, period? In a world of remote work, where you live and where you want to raise your family and where you want to spend time and all of that become very different decisions altogether. We've talked about this for decades, really, as we've looked at shifts in technology. So Steve, how do we think about that part of things?
No, you bet, Michelle. That's good. That's what's so interesting. I mean, how is all this going to play? Here we are in wonderful interactions with each other. We could be anywhere in the world and have the same kind of interaction and feeling more and more comfortable. So as we go back, we're not going to go back to the same way we were before. It's going to be fascinating to see as this recovery continues and as the pandemic eases and the vaccine finally comes along. What will remain? Cities have an enormously important role to play in being a catalyst for the interactions that lead to innovative solutions to various things. We're a different folk than we were when we all wanted to live out in the suburbs. The fastest growing age segment in America are men and women over the age of 85. There are only something like 1 out of every 4 households in America today have children living at home and wanting to be out in the suburbs. So there's going to be a range of different choices and opportunities for variety that will come. The smaller, more intermediate sized cities are becoming more attractive to many people. And again, with getting used to Zoom and all of the new technologies open up all those new opportunities. It'll be interesting in our surveys to be able to repeat the identical questions in January and February of 2021 and to see how much we changed as a consequence of this remarkable period that we're entering that no one quite knows how it's all going to play out as we go forward.
Well, on that note, I'm going to close the meeting. Thank everybody for spending the time with us on this Friday afternoon. Thanks to Bill and Brett and Steve for all of your wonderful ideas and insights. I think we have a lot in the chat and in the Q&A that should make us think a little bit, especially about a follow-up. I think we've got a follow-up program that we should do, especially when it comes to our energy sector preparedness, education, training, all of those kinds of things. I'd really like to see if we can tackle that at some point. So I'll bother you all about it. Want to wish everyone a great weekend. Thank you, and we'll be in touch.
Okay, thank you, Michelle.
Thanks,
All
guys.
right.
Great to
Thanks,
see you
Michelle.
guys. Okay.
Bye.
Take good care. Bill, good to see you.
Bye-bye. Good to see you as well.
Thank you.